what occurred was a replacing of that idea of the black legend, the idea of cruel, rapacious Spanish conquistadors killing natives and acting in horrible ways, with an idea of Spanish romanticismo. And we can see that in Florida's first poet laureate, Franklin N. Wood, who in 1931 wrote a sonnet, Tampa, saying, "Within the Spanish quarter of the town, in fancy I can hear, behind a wall, the trinkling of a troubadour's guitar." So that second tradition is a fairly complicated one that either demonizes the Spanish or overly romanticizes them. The third one is the one of the atrevidos, Spanish migrants to Florida who begin writing in English. Carolina Hospital is one of those. A review of her poetic memoir, The Child of Exile, calls her work an example of hyphenated dailiness. These are people who live in two worlds, and Carolina herself focuses on that in a lot of her poetry. One that I would really recommend to you is a wonderful poem titled How the Cubans Stole Miami. And she, of course, mocks what Anglos say by pointing out that the Cuban tide is simply another of the cultural waves which have swept over Miami. And we have had a great number of those writers. The first Cuban American to publish a book of poetry in English is Pablo Medina, and he called his book, perfect title, Pork Rinds and Cuban Songs. Perfect combination. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you know Cristina Garcia's Dreaming in Cuban, Ana Menendez, in Cuba I Was a German Shepherd, and one you may not know, Johnny Diaz, who moved from Miami to Boston and published Beantown Cubans, as an example. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of those writers who have been helping to influence us, including a number in theater. Florida is not really distinguished in our contribution to drama. Eduardo Machado and Dolores Prida have been doing some very interesting things in experimental theater. And Nilo Cruz won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for his wonderful play, Anna in the Tropics, which I really recommend that you see. And that is set in Tampa, which is the home of Jose Iglesias, the essayist and editor whose 1963 novel, Awake in Ybor City, gives him the right to be considered the godfather of these figures. And they're not only Cuban-American writers, there are writers like Yvonne Sapio, whose family comes from Puerto Rico on it. And she has written extensively about Florida, and she often involves Cuban imagery and separates herself from it as part of her attempt to suggest the pluralism of Hispanic experiences in Florida. The success and increasing visibility of these writers encouraged Anglo writers to rethink that Spanish tradition. The year before the United States Congress changed the name of Fort Marion back to the Castillo de San Marcos in 1942, Rosemary and Stephen Vincent Benet, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, also wrote Spanish Bayonet about his Menorcan ancestors, felt free to mock the legend of Hernando de Soto in rollicking amphibrax and anapest. Hernando de Soto was knightly, Hernando de Soto was bold. Like most of his lot, he'd be off like a shot wherever he heard there was gold. 1992, listen to the difference between that and X.J. Kennedy's view of the explorer realizing there's no fountain of youth. These Everglades dissolved his bones, rusted the cutlass blades. He felt the night wind harden. Arthritic raindrops dabbled at his tent. Was his resolve now like his wine casks spent. Destroying him, the angel begged his pardon. We have had lots of Anglo writers look at these issues. Barbara Winder has a wonderful poem titled Cuban Refugees on Key Biscayne, describing old men napping in the afternoon and suggesting that the true fountain of youth and the true return to Cuba for many of them will occur in their dreams as they sit sunning themselves. This revisionism is also apparent in the work of Cynthia Kahn, a wonderful poem, Florida Warns Her Colonists. It's a poet who died very, very young, far too young. And Florida Warns Her Colonists, Cynthia has Florida speaking about all colonists, from the original European colonists to tourists and snowbirds coming in. Campbell McGrath, one of the very hot young poets down in Miami, offers a perspective that allows all of us to be what we choose to be, including Dixie-fried Cubano rednecks. And he's always talking about his interaction with Cubans and how he begins to think he is more Spanish than they are, even though he is a Chicago-born Irish Catholic. But he's learning Spanish and he finds they want to talk English and they want to eat grits and they want to behave Floridian. Carol Frost, who was the 2011 medalist in the Florida Poetry Award, goes much farther in her Relación of Cabeza de Vaca, in which she talks about how de Vaca understood what he was doing. She completely revises the sense of who de Vaca was, which is also occurring among historians. So at this southernmost edge of the United States, an ethnically heterogeneous frontier with a flexible identity where America's past regularly confronts its future, our culture has always embraced diversity. While we attract and nurture a multitude of languages, I don't know if any of you saw the report of state officials about the number of languages spoken in our schools. Since so many of you are teachers, you probably are aware of this. But the state has identified 301 languages spoken in Florida schools. Now, I think they have a very broad definition of language to include dialects, but that's a lot of languages. And we have had Nobel laureates writing about Florida in Yiddish, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Italian, Dario Fo, Spanish, Juan Ramon Jimenez, and English, Ernest Hemingway. With all that, for almost 500 years, our essential literary and cultural DNA has consisted of dual strands of Spanish and English, encircling one another in a remarkable cultural ballet. While Spanish has been a primary language ever since Ponce de Leon first named La Florida in 1513, our English roots are almost as long, beginning with the translation of Jean Roubaud's lyrical The Whole and True Discovery of Terra Florida in 1563, and the lush description of our landscape in the 1564 song, Have You Not Heard of Florida? Over time, the rich and complex literary traditions of those two strands have become closer and closer, offering an extraordinary living example of the ways cultures and languages shape and enrich one another. Thank you.